The night of March 27, 1944, Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber climbed into his Junkers Ju-88 cockpit at Venlo airfield in the occupied Netherlands. He was a veteran with 23 kills, a recipient of the Knight's Cross, one of the Luftwaffe's elite Nachtjagd pilots. His aircraft carried the latest Liechtenstein SN2 radar, powerful enough to track British bombers from 4 kilometers away. He expected another successful hunt over the Reich. His radio operator, Unteroffizier Klaus Hoffmann, settled into position behind the radar scope. The twin Jumo engines roared to life. Within minutes, Weber's aircraft joined 40 others, lifting off from airfields across Holland and Western Germany. The bomber stream was coming. RAF Bomber Command was sending over 600 Lancasters and Halifaxes toward targets in the Ruhr. The German night fighter force scrambled to meet them. What happened in the next 2 hours shattered every assumption Friedrich Weber held about night combat. Not because the British bombers fought harder, not because new weapons appeared, but because an invisible hand seemed to guide every British night fighter directly to German aircraft with impossible precision. In those 2 hours, the Luftwaffe lost 37 night fighters. Friedrich Weber was not among the dead, but what he witnessed that night convinced him that Germany had already lost the technological war. The shock was not the losses themselves. Losses were expected. The shock was how the losses occurred. German pilots reported being ambushed by Mosquito night fighters that appeared from nowhere, striking with perfect coordination, vanishing before German radar could track them. Multiple crews described the same phenomenon. British fighters seeming to know exactly where German aircraft would be, attacking from optimal angles, coordinating their strikes as if watching the entire battle from above. The explanation eluded German intelligence for months. What Weber and his comrades encountered that night was not luck, not superior British courage, not even better aircraft. It was a radar system so advanced that a single station could track dozens of aircraft simultaneously, guide multiple interceptions at once, and coordinate defensive operations across hundreds of square kilometers of airspace. One radar installation directing 40 British night fighters against German bombers in a choreographed dance of electronic warfare that the Luftwaffe never imagined possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how this technological gulf emerged, we must return to 1941, when both Britain and Germany faced the same fundamental problem: how to guide fighters to invisible targets in darkness. The solution each nation developed reveals everything about their different approaches to technology, warfare, and the integration of human operators with electronic systems. Britain's earliest radar-directed night fighter operations relied on the Chain Home network, a series of coastal radar stations that could detect German bombers approaching across the English Channel. These stations used fixed antennas pointing seaward, capable of detecting aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 kilometers. But Chain Home had a critical limitation. Once enemy bombers crossed the British coastline, the radar lost them. The antennas faced outward, toward the sea. British territory itself remained a blind zone. This meant British night fighters relied on visual sightings reported by the Royal Observer Corps. Networks of volunteers stationed across Britain with binoculars and sound locators. In darkness, this system failed catastrophically. German bombers roamed British skies nearly unopposed during the early Blitz. RAF fighter controllers knew bombers were overhead somewhere, but couldn't guide. Interceptors close enough for pilots to see targets in the darkness. Royal Air Force scientists recognized this problem in 1939. Robert Hanbury Brown, a physicist working with the Telecommunications Research Establishment, calculated that the existing reporting system had an inherent inaccuracy of approximately 8 kilometers. For daylight interceptions, this was acceptable. Pilots could see targets 8 kilometers away in clear conditions, but at night, when pilots could barely see 1,000 meters ahead, 8-kilometer errors made interceptions impossible. Brown's 1939 memorandum proposed a revolutionary solution: arrange interceptions directly from radar displays, eliminating the telephone reporting delays that created inaccuracies. This required a fundamentally new radar system, one that could rotate continuously, showing everything in a complete circle around the station. one that displayed information in real time, allowing controllers to see both bombers and friendly fighters simultaneously on the same screen. One that gave positions accurate enough to guide night fighters within visual range of targets. British engineers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment developed this new system throughout 1940. They took an existing radar designed for coastal defence, added a motor to rotate it continuously, and connected it to a revolutionary display called the Plan Position Indicator. The PPI showed a two-dimensional map of the airspace, with the radar station at the centre and aircraft appearing as bright spots at their actual positions relative to the station. The first prototype ground-controlled interception radar, designated AMES Type 8, went operational at RAF Sopley on New Year's Day, 1941. The results were immediate and dramatic. Before GCI radar, British night fighters achieved successful interceptions in approximately 1 out of every 200 attempts. By May 1941, with several GCI stations operational and crews gaining experience, the success rate climbed to 7%, still modest, but a 14-fold improvement. The breakthrough came from eliminating human delays. In the old system, radar operators measured target positions, telephoned them to filter rooms, where other operators plotted them on maps, then telephoned updated positions to sector controllers, who radioed instructions to fighter pilots. This chain consumed 3 to 5 minutes. By the time instructions reached pilots, targets had moved kilometers from their reported positions. GCI radar collapsed this entire chain into a single operation. One controller watched the PPI display, seeing both the bomber and the night fighter simultaneously. He spoke directly to the pilot via radio, giving continuous guidance. Target bearing 045 degrees, range 12 kilometers, altitude 4,000 meters. Turn left heading 050. Descend to 3,500 meters. The pilot followed these instructions, watching his own position on the display converge with the target. When the fighter closed to within 2 kilometers, its own airborne radar could detect the bomber, and the pilot completed the interception visually. This system worked, but it had severe limitations. Early GCI stations could guide only one interception at a time. The PPI display was small, roughly 30 centimeters across. Only one controller could see it clearly. If multiple German bombers approached, the station had to choose which one to intercept while ignoring the others. And the radar itself was crude, built from modified coastal defense equipment, prone to failures, difficult to transport. But it proved the concept worked. British and German night fighters were now on equal footing technologically, except the British system was improving rapidly while German radar development stagnated. Germany's Luftwaffe had pioneered combat radar, the Freya early. The warning system went operational in 1939, providing early detection of British raids. The Würzburg tracking radar, with its distinctive parabolic dish antenna, achieved remarkable precision for its time. German engineers understood radar theory thoroughly. They had even developed airborne interception radar for night fighters, the Fugue 200 to Liechtenstein, before Britain fielded equivalent systems. Yet Germany never developed anything comparable to British GCI. German night fighter doctrine relied on the Himmelbett system, literally canopy bed, a network of radar-controlled zones stretching from Denmark to Switzerland. Each zone contained one Freya early warning radar, 2 Würzburg tracking radars, searchlights, and one assigned night fighter. When British bombers entered a zone, ground controllers used the Würzburg radars to track both the bomber and the night fighter simultaneously, directing the pilot by radio toward the target. This system worked adequately in 1940 and 1941. But it had fundamental limitations that German commanders never fully addressed. Each Himmelbett zone could guide exactly one night fighter at a time. If 5 British bombers flew through a zone simultaneously, the controller chose one to engage, while the other 4 passed unharmed. The system was geographically rigid. Fighters operated within their assigned zones. Coordinating defenses across multiple zones required telephone calls between control centers, introducing delays. Most critically, the Himmelbett concept assumed British bombers would attack dispersed across a wide front, allowing each zone to engage them individually. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong in May 1942, when RAF Bomber Command launched its first 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne. Instead of spreading out, British bombers concentrated into a tight stream, flooding through a handful of Himmelbett zones in rapid succession. The system collapsed. Controllers could engage one bomber every 15 to 20 minutes. In that time, dozens passed overhead unchallenged. German night fighter pilots recognized the problem immediately. They could see British bombers everywhere, silhouetted against searchlights and flares, but ground controllers refused to release them from their assigned zones. Doctrine demanded rigid adherence to zones. Initiative was discouraged. The technological capability existed to track multiple targets, but the operational system couldn't exploit that capability. This rigidity stemmed from fundamental German military philosophy. German doctrine emphasized human skill, experience, and intuition. Technology served to assist human decision-makers, not replace them. The radar operator tracked targets, but the controller made decisions. The controller gave guidance, but the pilot executed the intercept. Each human in the chain exercised judgment. This created flexibility in execution, but introduced delays at every step. Britain took the opposite approach. British doctrine increasingly automated warfare, removing humans from decision loops wherever possible. The radar tracked targets automatically. The controller read positions directly from the display without interpretation. Instructions to pilots were standardized, calculated from geometry rather than judgment. This reduced flexibility but collapsed decision time from minutes to seconds. By 1943, this philosophical difference was producing technological divergence. Germany continued refining its existing Himmelbett system, building more zones, adding more radars, training more controllers, quantity over innovation. Britain was developing entirely new radar systems that would render the Himmelbett concept obsolete. The RAF's AMES Type 7 radar, designated the final GCI, went operational in late 1941 at RAF Durrington. It was the first truly modern air defense radar. Instead of small mobile equipment, the Type 7 was a massive permanent installation. A rotating antenna array mounted above an underground chamber containing the transmitter. An operations building nicknamed the Happydrome housed controllers and displays. The system operated on a wavelength of 1.5 meters, frequency 209 MHz, with a range approaching 145 kilometers. The Type 7's PPI display was vastly larger than earlier systems, over 1 meter across, clearly visible to multiple controllers simultaneously. This single innovation transformed GCI operations. A station could now guide multiple interceptions at once. Different controllers watched different sectors of the same display, each guiding fighters towards separate targets. Coordination happened automatically because everyone saw the same picture. The operational transformation was profound. Where earlier GCI stations handled one interception at a time, Type 7 stations routinely managed 5 to 10 simultaneous engagements. During periods of intense activity, they controlled dozens of aircraft at once, directing fighters, monitoring bomber formations, coordinating with searchlight batteries and anti-aircraft guns. The radar became the hub of an integrated air defense system, not just a tracking device. Production accelerated through 1942 and 1943. By mid-1943, the RAF operated 20 permanent Type 7 GCI stations across Britain, with more under construction. These stations formed an inland radar network, complementing the coastal chain-home system. Any aircraft flying over Britain, whether crossing the coast or already inland, appeared on GCI displays. The blind zones that plagued early night defences no longer existed. German bombers discovered this in January 1944, when the Luftwaffe launched Operation Steinbock, the so-called Baby Blitz, retaliatory raids against British cities. German planners expected to exploit experience gained during the 1941 Blitz, using tactics that had once worked effectively. They anticipated British defences would be similar to 1941. Some radar coverage, some searchlights, moderate night fighter activity, manageable losses. The reality shocked German crews. British night fighters appeared with uncanny precision, attacking bombers that flew circuitous routes trying to avoid defences. Searchlights illuminated aircraft seemingly at random, but in fact directed by radar data. Anti-aircraft fire was more accurate than anyone remembered from the original Blitz. Losses on the first Steinbock missions exceeded 10% of attacking forces. German intelligence struggled to explain this. Captured equipment and technical analysis showed British radar wasn't fundamentally different from German systems. Both used similar frequencies, similar power outputs, similar antenna designs. The physics was identical. Yet British defences achieved coordination and effectiveness that German controllers found incomprehensible. The answer lay not in the radar hardware itself, but in how the system integrated information and directed responses. British GCI stations didn't just track aircraft, they coordinated entire defensive sectors. Multiple stations shared information through dedicated telephone networks. If one radar detected a target, controllers at neighbouring stations saw it automatically. Fighters could be vectored by whichever station had the best track. If one station failed, others maintained coverage. This network effect multiplied effectiveness geometrically. A German bomber entering British airspace didn't face one radar station. It faced a coordinated network where every station knew its position, where night fighters from multiple air bases could be directed toward it, where searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries received advance warning of its approach. The bomber crew saw individual defences engaging them. They never saw the invisible coordination making those engagements so deadly. By late 1943, British scientists had developed even more sophisticated systems. The Amos Type 14 used microwave frequency radar, providing dramatically better accuracy than earlier long-wave systems. When paired with a Type 7 for long-range detection, this combination, designated Ames Type 21, could detect aircraft at long range, then track them with extreme precision as they approached. Controllers could guide night fighters to within 500 meters of targets, well within range of the fighter's own airborne radar. The Type 21 entered service at RAF Sandwich in January 1944. Other stations received upgrades throughout the spring. By June 1944, most GCI stations operated Type 21 equipment. The improvements were measurable. During operations when German forces used window, aluminum foil strips that jammed radar, Type 21, stations maintained effective tracking where older systems went blind. Operators learned to distinguish real aircraft from chaff clouds by velocity and movement patterns. German signals intelligence intercepted British radar emissions and correctly identified new frequencies and operating modes. But German leadership never prioritized matching this technology. First, because German radar doctrine still emphasized early warning rather than precision fire control. Second, because German industrial capacity was stretched catastrophically thin by 1944. Third, because German commanders attributed British success to numerical superiority rather than technological advantage. They assumed more radars meant more coverage, missing the fact that integrated systems were qualitatively different from independent installations. The most advanced aspect of British GCI wasn't visible to German observers at all. It was the coordination between stations, the shared information, the redundant coverage, the doctrine that treated radar networks as unified systems rather than collections of individual sites. This integration happened through telephone networks, radio links, and standardized procedures. No exotic technology, just systematic organization that made the whole far more capable than the sum of its parts. On that night in March 1944, when Friedrich Weber's Ju-88 took off to intercept British bombers, he flew into an invisible electronic web he couldn't comprehend. Multiple GCI stations tracked his aircraft from takeoff. British controllers watched German fighters forming up, assessed their numbers and altitude, and vectored RAF Mosquito night fighters to optimal interception points. Weber thought he was hunting British bombers. In reality, he was being hunted. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The operations room at RAF Sandwich, Kent, hummed with controlled activity. The date was March 27th, 1944, shortly after 2100 hours. Flight Lieutenant David Morrison stood before the massive Type 21 radar display, its green phosphorescent screen showing dozens of aircraft tracks across the southern approaches to England. Morrison had been a GCI controller since 1942, but tonight's operation was unprecedented in scale. The plot showed German night fighters massing over Holland and Western Germany, not the usual scattered patrols, but a coordinated force of over 40 aircraft assembling at multiple staging points. British intelligence had anticipated this. RAF Bomber Command was launching a maximum effort against Essen, over 600 heavy bombers. The Luftwaffe was scrambling everything available to intercept them. What the Germans didn't know was that British tactics had evolved fundamentally. Bomber Command operations now included dedicated night fighter support from No. 100 Group, equipped with Mosquito night fighters carrying AI Mark 8 radar. These Mosquitoes weren't escorting bombers in the traditional sense. They were hunting German night fighters, turning predators into prey. Morrison's station at Sandwich was one of 4 GCI installations coordinating this operation. RAF Sopley covered the western approaches. RAF Neatishead monitored the North Sea. RAF Wartling watched the Central Channel. Together, these stations created an electronic fence across the approaches to Britain. Every German aircraft lifting off from Dutch and Belgian airfields appeared on their displays within minutes. The telephone rang. Morrison lifted the receiver. Sandwich Control. Sopley here. We have 15 hostiles assembling over Venlo, altitude 5,000 meters, heading 270. Can you take control when they enter your sector? Affirmative. We're tracking them now. I have 8 Mosquitoes on station, altitude 6,000 meters, waiting for your handoff. This was the revolution German commanders never grasped. British GCI stations didn't operate in isolation. They formed a coordinated network. Targets detected by one station were automatically shared with others. Fighters could be handed off between stations seamlessly. The entire system operated as a unified defensive grid, spanning Britain and the approaches across the Channel. Morrison studied the plot. German fighters were following predictable patterns, assembling at radio beacons before moving toward the bomber stream. The beacons, called Ida, Dora, and Otto, were supposed to be secret concentration points. British signals intelligence had mapped them all months earlier. Now they served as convenient markers where German fighters conveniently gathered, making them easy targets for British interception. Control to Nightshade Leader. Morrison spoke into his radio microphone. Vector 090, climb to 6,500 meters. Multiple hostiles at your 12 o'clock, range 40 kilometers. Nightshade Leader, Roger, climbing to 6,500. On the display, Morrison watched the Mosquito formation turn and climb. The German fighters showed as bright returns, their positions updated every few seconds as the Type 21 radar swept through its rotation. The Mosquitoes appeared as dimmer returns, marked with IFF codes, identifying them as friendly. Morrison could see the geometry developing perfectly. Nightshade Leader, hostiles now your 1 o'clock, range 30 kilometers, altitude 5,000 meters, heading 270. They're in loose formation, vector 085 for intercept. The Mosquito crews were experienced hunters. Squadron leader James Braham commanded Nightshade flight, 8 aircraft from No. 141 Squadron. His navigator, Flying Officer Michael Allen, watched their own AI Mark 8 radar scope. At 20 kilometers range, Allen began detecting returns. Contact, pilot. Multiple targets, bearing 087, range 18 kilometers. I have them on the display, Morrison confirmed from Sandwich. You're cleared to engage. Good hunting. What happened next demonstrated the technological chasm separating British and German night operations. The Mosquitoes used their AI radar to close on individual German fighters, approaching from behind and slightly below, using the darkness and the German crew's focus on tracking the distant bomber stream. The German Liechtenstein radars pointed forward, searching for bombers ahead. They had no rear-facing coverage. German crews had no warning until cannon shells tore through their aircraft. Friedrich Weber's Ju-88 was fifth in his formation when tracers suddenly streaked past his cockpit. His radio operator, Hoffmann, shouted a warning, but too late. 20mm cannon shells from a Mosquito hammered into the Junker's port engine. The engine erupted in flames. Weber rolled hard right, trying to evade, but the British fighter anticipated his maneuver perfectly, staying with him through the turn. More cannon fire. The Ju-88's tail section disintegrated. Weber had no choice. "Bail out! Bail out!" He struggled with the canopy as the aircraft spun wildly. Hoffmann managed to escape through the belly hatch. Weber followed seconds later, his parachute deploying just as the Ju-88 exploded behind him. He watched from his parachute as other German aircraft burned across the sky. Not one or two, but multiple fires, aircraft falling in flames or exploding in mid-air. The entire German formation was being systematically destroyed. In less than 10 minutes, the British Mosquitoes claimed 9 confirmed kills. Weber counted at least 12 separate fires before he descended into clouds. At Sandwich, Morrison directed the massacre with clinical precision. His display showed German fighters as they detected the Mosquitoes and tried to evade. But evasion was useless. Every turn the Germans made appeared on Morrison's screen in real time. He radioed updated vectors to British fighters constantly. Nightshade 3, hostile turning left, new heading 310, come left to 320 for re-intercept. The Mosquitoes had every advantage. They were faster than the German twin-engine night fighters, climbing to 480 km per hour against the Ju-88's maximum 440. Their AI radar was more sophisticated, harder to jam, and could track targets down to lower altitudes where older German sets lost contact in ground clutter. And they had ground control, providing tactical coordination no German pilot could match. German survivors described the engagement as nightmarish. Fighters that tried to form up for mutual defense were picked off individually. Aircraft that dove for cloud cover were followed by Mosquitoes, guided precisely to their positions by GCI controllers. Crews that attempted the standard evasive maneuvers, violent turns, altitude changes, speed variations found British fighters anticipating every move. What Weber and his comrades couldn't know was that RAF controllers were literally watching their evasive maneuvers on radar displays, telling Mosquito pilots exactly where German aircraft would be seconds before they arrived there. It wasn't anticipation. It was electronic prediction, geometry calculated from observed positions and velocities, radioed to fighters as simple heading corrections. The operational tempo at Sandwich reached levels impossible with earlier systems. Morrison and 3 other controllers managed simultaneous engagements across a front spanning 80 kilometers. The Type 21 radar tracked over 60 aircraft at once, its display automatically differentiating between hostiles, British bombers, and British fighters. Telephone calls with Sopley and Wartling provided redundant coverage, ensuring no German aircraft slipped through, undetected. Control to Nightshade Leader. You have additional hostiles approaching from the east, bearing 050, range 30 kilometers, altitude 4,000 meters. Can you engage after current intercept? Nightshade Leader. Negative. We're Winchester, heading home. Braham's flight had expended their cannon shells, destroying the first German formation. Understood. RTB approved. Shadow flight is inbound to your position. They'll take over patrol. This continuous coverage was another innovation German forces never matched. British night fighter squadrons rotated patrols, with fresh aircraft arriving as others depleted ammunition and fuel. GCI stations tracked both groups, handing off control smoothly. The defensive coverage never weakened, never showed gaps the Germans could exploit. Shadow flight, 8 more Mosquitoes from No. 85 Squadron, arrived on station 20 minutes later. Morrison vectored them toward a second, German formation approaching from the northeast. This group had learned from the first engagement's radio chatter. They were flying lower, trying to stay beneath British radar coverage, maintaining strict radio silence, approaching on irregular headings. It made no difference. The Type 21 radar detected low-altitude targets far more effectively than older systems. Morrison watched the German formation on his display, their attempted stealth futile against microwave radar operating in X-band frequency. He guided shadow flight into perfect intercept position, and the slaughter resumed. By midnight, the German night fighter force was shattered. Operations rooms across Holland and Germany struggled to account for missing aircraft. Radio calls went unanswered. Fighters that should have returned hours earlier remained overdue. Dawn reconnaissance would find wreckage scattered across Belgium and Holland, evidence of a one-sided massacre. Final tallies showed 37 German night fighters destroyed or damaged beyond repair that night, 74 crew members killed or captured. Against this, the RAF lost 2 Mosquito night fighters, both to mechanical failures rather than combat. The bomber stream reached Essen with minimal losses, dropping over 2,000 tons of bombs on target, then returned to England having lost only 18 aircraft to all causes, a loss rate below 3%, considered acceptable. German after-action reports reveal the confusion and despair this engagement created. Squadron commanders described aircraft losses as unprecedented. Night fighter Geschwader that sent up 40 aircraft returned with 25. Experienced crews with dozens of kills, like Weber's, were shot down without landing a single blow against British bombers. The Nachtjagd had been rendered impotent. Intelligence officers interviewed survivors desperately seeking explanations. What new weapon had the British deployed? Were there more Mosquitoes than estimated? Had German radar been jammed? The survivors' accounts were consistent, but seemingly impossible. British fighters appeared to know German positions at all times, attacked from optimal angles, and coordinated their strikes with perfect timing. Multiple pilots reported that British aircraft followed their evasive maneuvers as if reading their minds. One report, filed by Hauptmann Ernst Müller, commander of the 3rd Group of Nachtjagdgeschwader 6, came closest to the truth without fully grasping it. British night fighters demonstrate coordination suggesting central control from ground stations. Evasive maneuvers are anticipated rather than followed. Recommend investigation of British ground control capabilities. This recommendation went nowhere. German High Command attributed the losses to British numerical superiority, superior aircraft performance, and bad luck. The possibility that British radar technology and operational integration had surpassed German capabilities by such a margin seemed inconceivable to commanders who remembered Germany's radar advantage in 1940. The technological gap was actually widening, not closing. While Germany struggled to produce enough basic radar sets to equip its defences, Britain was deploying systems like the Type 21 that represented entirely new generations of capability. By mid-1944, the production disparity was crushing. Britain manufactured approximately 1,500 radar systems annually across all types. Germany managed roughly 2,400 radar units per year, but these were spread across early warning, fire control, naval, and air interception roles. Britain's specialised GCI network alone exceeded German production of equivalent systems by factors of 10 or more. Quality compounded quantity. British Type 21 installations cost approximately £40,000 each, required 200 personnel to operate and maintain, and consumed massive amounts of electrical power. The investment seemed extravagant, but one Type 21 station could coordinate defensive operations across thousands of square kilometres, guide dozens of fighters simultaneously, and operate continuously regardless of weather. The return on investment was measured in German aircraft destroyed and British bombers protected. Germany never made equivalent investments. German GCI stations, where they existed at all, were mobile units based on modified Würzburg radars, transportable, flexible, and cheap to produce. They were also limited to single-target tracking, vulnerable to jamming, and incapable of the coordination British stations achieved routinely. German doctrine valued mobility and tactical flexibility. British doctrine valued capability and strategic integration. When these philosophies collided over the night skies of Europe, the result was predictable and one-sided. The technical details reveal why. British Type 21 systems operated with multiple controllers watching a single large display, each managing different sectors simultaneously. Communications between controllers happened verbally, instantly, within the same room. German systems required telephone coordination between separate radar sites, introducing delays measured in minutes. British fighters received continuous guidance from controllers watching real-time displays. German fighters received intermittent updates based on radar positions several minutes old. Processing speed made the difference between effective and useless guidance. British controllers updated fighter vectors every 10 to 15 seconds based on current radar data. German controllers calculated intercept courses manually using mechanical predictors, updating fighters every 2 to 3 minutes. In those minutes, fast-moving aircraft covered dozens of kilometers. By the time German fighters reached projected intercept points, British bombers had long since departed. British systems automated what German systems left to human judgment, calculating intercept angles, determining optimal altitude, estimating time to target. These were mathematical problems solved by geometry, not tactical problems requiring experienced controllers. British doctrine standardized these solutions, teaching controllers to read positions from displays and calculate vectors using simple rules. German doctrine relied on skilled controllers making intuitive judgments. Intuition was slower than mathematics. Slower meant ineffective. The human element couldn't compensate for systematic technological disadvantage. German night fighter pilots were as skilled and brave as any. Their aircraft were adequate, sometimes superior to British equivalents in specific parameters. Their radar equipment, when functioning properly, could track targets effectively. But individual excellence couldn't overcome system-level inferiority. A skilled pilot flying blind into British defences faced coordinated opposition that saw him coming from 100 kilometres away, tracked his every move, and directed multiple fighters to intercept him. The March 1944 engagement was not exceptional. It was typical of British GCI operations by that point in the war. Similar massacres occurred regularly throughout the spring and summer. Operation Steinbock, which began in January 1944 and continued through May, saw German bomber formations destroyed systematically by RAF night defences. Luftwaffe records show that, of roughly 520 bombers participating in Steinbock raids, over 330 were destroyed or damaged, a loss rate exceeding 60%. Night fighter interceptions accounted for the majority of these losses. These weren't sustainable casualties. No air force could maintain operations, losing 3 aircraft for every 5 deployed. By May 1944, Luftwaffe bomber operations against Britain had effectively ceased. The remaining aircraft were withdrawn to Germany for defensive operations against Allied bombers. The baby blitz ended not because Germany achieved its objectives, but because German forces could no longer survive the operational environment British defences had created. The destruction of the German night fighter force in March 1944 represented more than tactical defeat. It demonstrated that modern warfare had entered an era where electronic systems determined outcomes more decisively than human courage or mechanical engineering. German pilots and crews were not inferior. German aircraft were not obsolete. But German operational systems couldn't compete with British integration of radar, communications, and coordinated response. Friedrich Weber survived his parachute descent and was captured by Dutch resistance members who turned him over to British forces. In captivity, he was interrogated by RAF intelligence officers seeking to understand German night fighter tactics. Weber's answers revealed how completely German crews misunderstood what they faced. He attributed British success to larger numbers of night fighters, better aircraft performance, and superior training. The possibility that British ground control was guiding interceptions with radar-derived precision never occurred to him. German doctrine didn't include that concept, so German pilots couldn't imagine it. When RAF interrogators explained that British controllers had watched his entire formation on radar displays, tracked individual aircraft, and directed Mosquitoes to specific targets chosen from dozens of returns, Weber initially refused to believe it. The technological capability seemed fantastical. Multiple aircraft tracked simultaneously, real-time updates every few seconds, controllers directing intercepts by simply reading positions from screens. It contradicted everything German training had taught about radar limitations. Only when shown photographs of British GCI installations, with their massive displays and multiple controller stations, did Weber begin to understand. Even then, he struggled to grasp the operational implications. His experience with German radar was of individual stations tracking single targets with manual direction. The concept of networked stations, sharing data, coordinating responses, and managing dozens of simultaneous engagements fell outside his frame of reference. This incomprehension extended throughout the Luftwaffe chain of command. German generals receiving loss reports attributed them to factors within their understanding: enemy numerical superiority, declining German pilot quality due to accelerated training, mechanical unreliability of overtaxed equipment. The systematic technological inferiority of German air defense systems was never acknowledged at the highest levels, perhaps because acknowledging it would require admitting the war was already lost. By June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, British GCI stations had achieved complete dominance over German night operations. The invasion fleet was protected by over 200 radar-equipped vessels and shore installations, creating a defensive umbrella that German aircraft couldn't penetrate. Luftwaffe sortie rates against invasion beaches were minimal. Those aircraft that did approach were intercepted with near certainty, resulting in loss rates exceeding 20% per mission. The Germans had lost not just battles, but the technological race that determined whether battles could even be fought. An air force without effective radar coordination in 1944 was like cavalry charging machine guns in 1914, brave, obsolete, and doomed. The Luftwaffe's night fighter force, once Germany's most effective defense against British bombing, had been rendered nearly irrelevant by an invisible electronic web they never truly understood. The aftermath of the March 1944 engagement, and dozens like it throughout the spring, forced changes across the German air defense network that came too late to matter. Luftwaffe commanders recognized that night operations against Britain had become suicidal. Nachtjagd units were withdrawn from offensive operations and redeployed for defensive missions over Germany itself, trying to stem the tide of American daylight bombing raids and British night raids. But even in defensive roles, German night fighters faced the same technological disadvantages. RAF Bomber Command now routinely deployed Mosquito intruders over Germany, hunting German fighters near their own airfields. British GCI stations were being established on the continent as Allied armies advanced eastward. The electronic web was expanding, following the ground forces, maintaining pressure on what remained of the Luftwaffe. German attempts to develop equivalent systems failed repeatedly. Prototypes for improved GCI radars existed. The Jagdschloss system, with plan, position indicator displays similar to British equipment, underwent testing in late 1943, but production was delayed by Allied bombing of electronics factories, material shortages, and the chaos of Germany's collapsing war economy. By the time production finally began in early 1945, fewer than 20 Jagdschloss installations were operational. Too few, too late, and operating in an environment where Allied air superiority made them ineffective regardless of technical capability. The production statistics tell the story starkly. In 1944, Britain produced over 2,000 radar systems across all categories. Germany produced approximately 2,400, but was losing ground. Allied bombing destroyed manufacturing capacity faster than it could be replaced. Critical components like precision vacuum tubes were in chronic shortage. Skilled technicians were being conscripted for frontline combat roles as manpower shortages intensified. By 1945, German radar production had collapsed to a fraction of 1944 levels. Meanwhile, British and American factories were producing electronic systems in quantities that would have seemed impossible in 1943. The Type 21 GCI radar, which seemed extravagantly expensive and complex in 1944, was being mass-produced and deployed not just in Britain but across liberated Europe. American equivalents, the SCR 527 series, were equipping U.S. forces in even larger numbers. The mathematical reality was inescapable. By mid-1945, Allied forces possessed more than 10 times the radar capability Germany could field, with qualitative advantages multiplying that quantitative edge. German aircraft operating in European skies faced detection from hundreds of kilometers away, tracking throughout their missions, and coordinated interception by fighters guided with precision German defenders couldn't approach. Friedrich Weber's story had an epilogue that illustrated the war's end. Released from British captivity in 1945, he returned to Germany to find his former airfield abandoned, equipment destroyed or captured, and his squadron disbanded. Of the 42 pilots who had served in his unit during 1944, only 11 survived the war. The others were killed in combat, died in accidents, or disappeared in the chaos of Germany's collapse. Weber never flew combat missions again. After the war, he worked as a civilian flight instructor, teaching a new generation of German pilots. In interviews decades later, he spoke about his night fighter experiences with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. Pride in his squadron's achievements, pride in their courage against overwhelming odds, but bewilderment at how completely they had been outmatched technologically without even understanding it at the time. "We were brave," he said in a 1978 interview. "We were skilled. Our aircraft were adequate, but we were fighting the previous war. The British were fighting the future. Their radar controlled the sky. We just flew through it, hoping to survive." The lessons from this technological divergence influenced every subsequent development in air defense. Post-war air forces recognized that ground-controlled interception was not an auxiliary capability, but the foundation of modern air defense. The integration of radar, communications, and coordinated response became doctrine. Human pilots remained essential, but they operated within electronic systems that guided them, protected them, and multiplied their effectiveness. American post-war development led to the semi-automatic ground environment, SAGE, in the 1950s. SAGE used building-sized computers to integrate dozens of radar stations, automatically track hundreds of aircraft, calculate optimal intercepts, and transmit instructions directly to fighter autopilots. It was the logical evolution of principles proven by British GCI in 1944. Automation eliminates delays, integration multiplies capability, and systems defeat individual excellence. Soviet air defense development followed similar paths, creating networks of integrated radar stations and command centers, controlling fighters and surface-to-air missiles. Modern systems from Patriot to S-400 trace their operational concepts directly to wartime GCI. Radar detects, computers calculate, systems engage, humans supervise rather than directly control. The specific technologies have evolved beyond recognition. Modern phased array radars bear no physical resemblance to rotating Type 21 antennas. Digital computers processing millions of calculations per second replaced room-sized mechanical predictors and manual plotting. Data links send instructions at light speed instead of voice radio, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged from those established by RAF GCI stations in 1944. First principle: automated tracking beats human observation. Every modern air defense system uses automated radar tracking rather than relying on human operators to manually follow targets. The human error and delay that plagued German Himmelbett systems are avoided through electronic processing. Second principle: integrated networks multiply effectiveness. Modern air defense connects multiple radar sites, sharing data to eliminate blind spots and provide redundant coverage. The coordination that British GCI stations achieved through telephone networks now happens through encrypted data links, but the concept is identical. Third principle: calculated fire solutions beat intuitive aiming. Whether directing fighters or guiding missiles, modern systems use mathematical calculation of intercept geometry rather than human judgment. The standardized vector calculations British controllers used in 1944 evolved into the complex algorithms modern fire control computers execute, but both serve the same purpose: removing human delay from the engagement sequence. Fourth principle: the system defeats the component. Individual system performance matters less than integration. German radar was adequate, German fighters were capable, German pilots were skilled. But these components weren't integrated into an effective system. Britain's advantage came from treating air defence as a unified system, rather than a collection of individual capabilities. These principles seem obvious now. In 1944, they were revolutionary insights that contradicted centuries of military tradition, emphasizing individual skill and human judgment. The concept that removing humans from decision loops could make systems more effective, not less, ran counter to military culture built around leadership, initiative, and personal courage. But mathematics proved more decisive than tradition. The engagement on March 27, 1944, demonstrated conclusively that automated, integrated systems could destroy skilled, courageous opponents who lacked equivalent technology. The same demonstration was repeated throughout the final year of the war, in air defense, in anti-aircraft gunnery, in fire control systems, and eventually in guided weapons. The human cost of this technological transition was measured in thousands of German air crews who died fighting a war they couldn't win, because the fundamental nature of warfare had changed beneath them. They trained for individual combat, skill against skill. They encountered systematic technological opposition that rendered skill almost irrelevant. A perfectly executed night fighter attack meant nothing when British controllers watched it developing from 100 kilometers away and vectored Mosquitoes to intercept before German pilots even saw the bomber stream. For the victors, the lesson was clear. Future wars would be won by nations that integrated technology effectively, not just by those that developed advanced weapons. The radar itself was less important than the doctrine that employed it. The computer was less critical than the system it enabled. Success came from treating warfare as an engineering problem amenable to systematic solution, rather than as a test of courage and individual excellence. This represented a profound shift in military thinking that reverberates into the present. Modern military forces emphasize network integration, information dominance, and systematic coordination over traditional metrics of individual unit capability. The Air Force with better fighter aircraft may lose to the force with better integration of radar, command and control, and coordinated response. The lesson learned over the night skies of Europe in 1944 remains valid. Systems beat hardware, integration beats individual excellence, and information superiority determines outcomes before weapons are even engaged. Friedrich Weber's story, and the destruction of his squadron on that March night, became a footnote in the vast historical record of World War II, but it represented a turning point as significant as the introduction of radar itself. It marked the moment when warfare fully entered the electronic age, when invisible electromagnetic energy became as important as visible fire and steel, when human courage alone could no longer compensate for technological inferiority. The German pilots who died in those engagements were not failures. They were casualties of a revolution they never understood, fighting enemies they couldn't see with weapons that couldn't reach them, opposed by systems they couldn't comprehend. Their courage was genuine. Their skills were real. Their defeat was inevitable. The British controllers who guided those interceptions were not exceptional warriors. They were technicians following standardized procedures, reading positions from screens, calculating vectors using geometry, speaking instructions into microphones. Their advantage came not from superior courage or skill, but from superior systems that made courage and skill more effective than equivalent human qualities operating without those systems. This was the future of warfare, visible in 1944 to those who looked closely enough. A future where technology and integration mattered more than individual heroism, where systematic coordination defeated tactical brilliance, where electronics determined outcomes before humans could even perceive the battle. The age of electronic warfare had begun, and Germany discovered too late that they had been fighting without understanding the new rules. The radar stations that made this transformation possible have mostly vanished. RAF Sandwich was demolished in the 1960s. Sopley operated until 1974, then was closed and converted to civilian use. Wartling became a communications station before eventual abandonment. The massive Type 21 antennas were scrapped for metal. The underground transmitter chambers were filled with rubble. The operations buildings were torn down or repurposed. But the legacy of these installations persists in every modern air defense system. Every time a radar tracks multiple targets automatically, that's the heritage of Type 21. Every time ground controllers coordinate fighters through data links, that's the legacy of GCI doctrine. Every time integrated air defense networks protect airspace through systematic coordination, that's the legacy of the British system that destroyed German night fighters in 1944. The invisible advantage of superior electronics, proven decisively in those night battles over Europe, became the foundation of modern military power. Nations that mastered this lesson, treating warfare as a systems problem, requiring technological integration rather than simply individual excellence, dominated subsequent conflicts. Nations that failed to learn it paid the same price Germany paid. Skilled forces rendered impotent by systematic technological disadvantage they couldn't overcome through courage alone. Friedrich Weber understood this, eventually. In his later years, he spoke to military historians and aviation enthusiasts, describing his experiences but always emphasizing the technological lesson. "We were not defeated by better pilots," he would say. "We were defeated by better systems. That is the lesson Germany learned too late, and that other nations must never forget." Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.